Welcome back to the Photaudiography podcast. I'm your host Luke, and today I'll be talking about the rules of photography composition. Now first I should mention that there aren't really any strict rules of photography, and the whole point of this podcast being an audio format rather than a visual format is so that you can feel free to be creative and experiment with your own photography and to find what techniques you enjoy most. Overall, you want your photos to convey a story to the viewer, and the following guidelines can help you with that. If you're using photography as a creative outlet to express yourself, which I think most people listening to the podcast are, create images that look good to you. When people ask about advice for, let's say, wedding photographers or photographers for other events, I'll often tell the person to go to the photographer's website and look at the pictures on the website and see if they like them. If they like them, I say go with that photographer. Each photographer has their own interpretation of the following guidelines, and each has their own unique perspective of the world around them. There's a lot of science and math behind photography, but there's also a lot of artistry behind it as well. So I'll go over these hopefully relatively quickly, not to bore you with too many, but just give you a little background, because I'm sure you've probably heard these words floating around in the photography world, and maybe you're not quite sure what they mean, so I'll try to go through them and give you the best explanation I can. First, I'd like to start with what's called fill the frame. So what this is your subject fills the entire photo, and this avoids the need for a background and puts the subject really in focus because there's pretty much nothing else in the frame. Now, contrasting that, there's also this aspect of negative space and breathing room in photography. And leaving negative space can simplify an image and create minimalism for your photo and draw the focus to the subject. And this contradicts sort of fill the frame technique. So I would challenge you to use both fill the frame and also leaving negative space / breathing room with the same subject and see what kind of results you get and see what you like better. And this all depends on sort of the subject and the look you're going for. It's very opposite, but they're both very good techniques to try out. Another technique you've probably heard about is the rule of thirds. So what this does, it divides the shot both horizontally and vertically into thirds. And then the intersection of these sort of, if you think of them as lines dividing, the intersection of the lines dividing horizontally and vertically sort of are the sweet spots to position your subject in one of those four intersections. And also the third lines for like the horizontal lines are a good place to position the horizon or horizontal subjects, and then the vertical lines separating the shot vertically into thirds are a great place to put vertical subjects. And it's important to remember with this technique that the main goal is to get your subject out of the middle of the photo. So I think, just sort of keeping that in mind, not getting too hung up on, where exactly am I supposed to put my subject, but more saying, let's not put the subject in the middle of the frame all the time. And some cameras even have settings that will show a grid, like a rule of thirds grid on the screen or in the viewfinder for you, which is nice. And along with this, I want to talk a little bit about balance. So when working with the rule of thirds, you need to be careful that your image doesn't feel lopsided. You may need to get a secondary subject sort of on the opposite side of the frame in the background or something. This isn't always the case, but I think you'll find that if you try too hard to use the rule of thirds for every single shot, you might find that your feeling lopsided with your photos. So make sure there's a good balance there. And like I say, they're called rules, but they're more of guidelines and sort of things to play around with. Another topic I'd like to talk about is leading lines and sort of shapes. So leading lines is pretty much how it sounds. They're lines that draw the attention toward the subject and sort of provide an aesthetically pleasing photo. Examples of this can be like roads or bridges with like repeating patterns, anything that has long pointing lines basically to draw the attention. This technique is often used, I'll see it like a subject is standing on a train track or on a road, and there's the lines of the train track or the road are sort of leading the eye to the subject. And I want to just pause here and tell you that things like roads and train tracks are great for visually, having those leading lines. However, please, under no circumstances, take photos on or around working train tracks. I can't stress that enough. It's very dangerous. I'm pretty sure it's illegal. So please do not take photos on working train tracks. Also, busy roads, hopefully I can trust everyone to use common sense, but please do not put your subjects or yourself in danger. Do not take photos on busy roads. Next, I'd like to talk about the backgrounds of photos, and this is sort of a broad subject, but I want to stress that you want to make sure your background is not distracting, because I know a lot of times photographers will work a lot on setting up a studio so that they have a clean background, and that's very important. But also, if you're using a technique such as fill the frame, you really don't have to worry too much about a background in your photo. But a lot of situations you won't want to use fill the frame and you'll have a background. And first of all, I just want to say it's easy to be focused your eye on the subject, but then whenever you actually look at a photo, you sort of see it without that filter of our human eye, and you see the photo for what it was, flaws and all. So our eyes have a great way of sort of getting rid of the things we don't want to see and just seeing what we do want to see. And that's sort of how you have to learn the camera language of being aware of what's in the background and making sure it's not distracting, such as if you have a subject and there's sort of a tree coming out of their head. I think that's a very common example of things you want to look out for. Like, you don't want to make sure there's not a tree coming out of someone's head or like a building coming out of their shoulder or something. Also, an easy technique if you have a background that's sort of busy or distracting is use a wider aperture to blur the background to make it less distracting. And that's something in a future podcast I'll be talking more about aperture and depth of field, but that's one very quick way you can sort of eliminate the background, is just kind of blur it out. Something I want to touch, and it doesn't have a whole lot to do with background, but it's just something I didn't know where exactly to mention it, is I always see people standing in front of buildings or, large tapestries or trees, monuments, things, and the person is standing right up next to it, and then the photographer takes the picture and you can barely see the person. They're tiny compared to the big statue or building or whatever it is. And here's my technique that I use all the time, and I think it's very simple, and if more people knew about this, they would use it and have much better photos. If you're taking a picture, let's say, of a lighthouse, and you want someone standing by it, you're not going to be able to get the lighthouse in the shot unless you have a very wide angle lens. What you need to do is bring the subject toward you and have the lighthouse or whatever it is in the background. if you set the camera settings right, make sure that the background isn't completely blurred. You'll still see the lighthouse in the background, and you'll also have a nice big subject. Your subject won't look tiny, and you won't have to be like, is that whoever you were taking the picture of? You will see the subject, and you'll also see the building or the monument, whatever you wanted to take the picture of. Now, this isn't always the case. I mean, sometimes you want to exaggerate to show how tall something is versus someone standing next to it. That's up to your discretion, but I think something that people don't realize is, go stand next to that monument. Well, no, that's not the best technique to use usually, because the subject will look so small next to this big monument, and in order to get the whole monument or building or whatever in the shot, the subject will have to be so small that they'll be almost unrecognizable. So bring the subject closer to you and sort of put the monument or building or whatever more in the background. That's a huge suggestion that I think makes holiday snapshots and things so much better, is bring those subjects closer, because that's really what you want to see. You want to see the people's faces, and sort of the monument or whatever, it's okay being in the background as long as you have your settings set so that you can still recognize what it is in the background. Alright, enough on that tangent. Let's move on to looking for patterns, and I sort of touched on this with the leading lines, but patterns often make a photo more interesting, and if there's a break in the pattern, that can also create a very unique sort of subject for your photo. So look for patterns in nature, in buildings, all around you. Another technique, which again we've sort of touched on, is simplify your shot, and you can do this using a variety of techniques, such as fill the frame or leaving negative space, but just sort of keep the foreground or background simple, a shallow depth of field right on the subject. The subject can be right in the middle of the frame. Sometimes it works, sometimes you want to use the rule of thirds, but whatever it is, try just simplifying your shot. Instead of colorful background for a school portrait, use either a black or a white background. See if that looks nicer. Now, sort of in contrast with simplify your shot is and especially for dramatic shots or landscape shots, you want to create depth. So you want to have a foreground, middle ground, and background for a full shot. So this will really give your image a story, and depending on where everything is situated, can really lead the viewer toward the subject or sort of through the story of your image. And again, back to the sort of balance, make sure the photo is not out of balance. Make sure that the main subject is not being drowned out by the foreground or the background. Make sure you can still see the main subject, but also it's a real balancing act to try to get sort of the foreground, middle ground, background, and get your subject all in there. So yeah, you'll have to try it out, see what you can do with that. And again, it's not every image that you want to have this sort of great depth of field. Along with creating depth of field and sort of that story is you want to change your point of view. Don't always take photos at eye level. Crouch down, lay on the ground, get on a step ladder, get to a higher vantage point. I always like to think that you want to make your photos something that people don't see every day. And that's something that's really carried with me and my sort of artistry with photography is I always want to take a photo of something people don't just walking in their everyday life will see. I want to make it sort of surreal almost. You know that these things exist, but you don't really see them on an everyday basis. So just sort of changing your point of view, getting closer. Macro photography is a whole lot of fun. I don't do a lot of it, but if that's something you're interested in, it's definitely a lot of fun. Along with sort of that artistry that I was talking about, it's important to pay attention to colors that are in your photos and be sure that colors that are in your photos are complementary and don't clash with one another. So take a look at that color wheel, see what works and what doesn't work. If somebody's wearing, a certain color shirt and you have a certain color background, it may or may not work. That's what you have to sort of decide, and that's where sort of simplify the shot or fill the frame might come into play. Is I really don't want to make the color of this person's shirt or the color of the background important. I want to make their face the most important thing. Other times it's I want to see a little bit of their attire. If it's a professional headshot, you want to see that they're dressed professionally. Also, along with color, is having a photo that's sort of all one color theme, especially like a landscape photo, can be very pleasing to the eye, such as like a golden sunset over a wheat field. There's lots of yellows, oranges, golds, browns. Having a photo that sort of has that theme of sort of one color that can be really beautiful. So keep an eye out for that. Something that sort of to me just makes sense, but to other people might be a little bit hard to understand, is you want to pay attention to the direction your subject is moving. So if you have a moving subject in a photo, even if it's not a moving subject, but even if it's something like a car that sort of suggests movement, even if it's parked, you want to give room for that subject to move. So what I mean by that is if you're taking a picture, let's say, of a parked car, and the front end is on the right-hand side of the photo, you want to leave extra room on that right-hand side of the photo to allow the viewer to visualize the car moving forward. This isn't always the case, especially, a parked car is probably a bad example, but just to get my point across, you want to leave room for your subject to move into the photo. If you have someone, walking or jogging in your photo, and they're about to jog off the photo, that's going to be a little bit unsettling to the viewer, and maybe that's sort of the point you're going for. And like I say, these are all guidelines. You kind of have to use your discretion and your artistry based on what technique you're trying to do, but that's just an example that you want to leave room. So if someone's walking in your frame, you want to leave enough room forward in front of them so that they don't look like they're going to walk off the page. And normally you'll want to have the subject moving left to right on the image, sort of the same way we would read on a page. This isn't always the case, but in general, that's sort of the rule of thumb, is that you should have them moving left to right in the frame. Now, something that's maybe a little bit more advanced or abstract is something called golden triangles, and I wanted to throw this one in here just because you may be hearing it thrown around. And this is similar to the rule of thirds, only this is more to deal with diagonals in a frame. So what the golden triangles, and you can look up to see visually what this is, but I'll try to explain it as clear as I can through audio, is that the frame is divided diagonally from one corner to the opposite corner. So like a line going diagonally through the whole frame. Then the other two corners, two smaller lines, come in from those corners and meet the original diagonal line. So in simpler terms, photos that have diagonals within them, when done right, usually can be very visually pleasing. So the golden triangle sort of makes a template of how to have the diagonals within the frame, but a lot of times, if it's buildings or just perspective, as things move away from as things are farther away from the camera, they sort of get smaller. If there's repetition, they're sort of automatically a diagonal, because if, let's say it's lamp posts, and the one closest to you looks bigger, but the one farther away looks smaller, and that sort of automatically creates a diagonal and sort of like a leading line too. So that's sort of just briefly touching on golden triangles. Again, it's similar to the rule of thirds in that it's divided and you want diagonals being in certain places to make it more visually pleasing, but just the general gist is, if you have diagonals done in a certain way, they will look very visually pleasing in your photo. And the last sort of tip for composition, and I touched on this before with some of our other composition elements, is focus. Using a wider aperture will give you a shallower depth of field, which lets you really select what you want your main focal point to be. And this can provide a visually interesting story. Like if you have a family walking their dog and you want the focus to just be on the dog, you can create a shallow depth of field and have that focus be only on the dog and have the family sort of in the background, blurred out a little bit. And it just depends on what kind of story you're trying to tell, but using a shallow depth of field can really make a huge difference when trying to convey a story or make a photo more visually interesting, or try to get rid of distractions that may be around the photo. So hopefully that gives you a brief overview of some of the compositional guidelines to try with your photography. I tried to be brief with them and hopefully didn't confuse you too much about them, but hopefully just, got you thinking a little bit, and hopefully you'll want to try some of these out and just get out and take some photos, try some different techniques. And a lot of times I think it's interesting to try different techniques using the same subject. So like I was mentioning earlier with fill the frame versus leaving negative space or breathing room, try it on the same exact subject, whether it be, a statue or a lamppost or something. Do one, fill the frame, do the other, leaving tons of negative space, and see what kind of results you like, see what kind of results you get. And a lot of times it's very situational. Certain situations lend themselves to different techniques. So that's why I tried to go over a lot of different ones all in one podcast. We could spend a whole podcast talking about each one of these, but sort of just to give you a general overview, because you're going to have to use a lot of combinations of these and just have a general knowledge of different techniques that are good to try out with different photos. So, alright, I think that's enough bad advice I have for you for now, so I'll see you later, Shutterbugs.